In the same discourse he makes it plain that all are guilty of innocent murder who do not oppose it, from Jeremiah's words in his defense before the principals, quote, "Know ye for certain, if ye put me to death, ye shall surely bring innocent blood upon yourselves and upon the city and upon the inhabitants thereof," unquote. Now, if the princes and the whole people should have been guilty of the prophet's blood, how shall others be judged innocent before God if they suffer the blood of innocence to be shed when they may save it? Third, he argues from the distinction between the person placed in authority and the ordinance of God. The one may be resisted, the other cannot. The plain words of the apostle makes the difference. Quote, "The ordinances of God for preservation of mankind, punishment of vice, which is holy and constant. Persons commonly are profane and unjust. He that resisteth the power there is only meant of the just power within God, wherewith God hath armed his magistrates, which whoso resists God's ordinances. But if men, in the fear of God, oppose themselves to the fury of princes, they then resist not God, but the devil, who abuses the sword and authority of God. It is evident the people resisted Saul when they had sworn Jonathan should die, whom they delivered. The Spirit of God accuses them not of any crime, but praises them and condemns the king. This same Saul again commanded the priests of the Lord to be slain. His guard would not obey, but Doeg put the king's cruelty in execution. I will not ask whether the king's servants, not obeying, resisted the ordinance of God, or whether Doeg's murdering gave obedience to just authority. The Spirit of God condemns that fact, Psalm 52, that God would not only punish the commander, but also the merciless executor. Therefore, they who gainstood his command resisted not the ordinance of God. Fourth, he argues from examples not only of resisting, but of punishing tyrants. Chiefly the example of Uzziah is pertinent to this purpose, 2 Chronicles 26, who after his usurping the priest's office was put out of the temple, unquote. When it was replied that they were the priests that withstood the king, not simple people, he answered, quote, "The priests were subject, as Abiathar was deposed by Solomon, etc. Yet they made him go out of the temple for his leprosy, and the people put him from the kingdom," unquote. It is noted also that Mr. Knox in that discourse adduces examples of those who used to be brought in as objections against offensive arms, even the primitive Christians before the passage last cited. Quote, "What precepts," says he, the apostle gave, "I will not affirm, but I find two things the faithful did. The one was, they assisted their preachers even against the rulers. The other was, they suppressed idolatry wheresoever God gave unto them force, asking no leave of the emperor, nor of his deputies. Read the ecclesiastical histories, and ye shall find examples sufficient," unquote. Fourth, in the next place, we may inquire into the judgment of these reformers concerning that question that is now so puzzling to many, which indeed was never started before this time as a head of suffering, but now, when it is stated, we may gather from our ancestors' actings and determinations about it how it ought to be answered. They were indeed in capacity, and accordingly did improve it, for disowning the authority of both the queens. For their capacity was not the thing that made it duty, if it had not been so before. Capacity makes a thing possible, but not lawful. It does indeed make a duty seasonable and clears the call to it, and regulates the timing of affirmative duties, but the want of it can never dispense with negative precepts, and a duty, negative especially, may become necessary when it hath not the advantage of seasonableness or capacity. Certainly it were duty to depose the Pope from his usurped authority, and to disown it even in Rome itself. But there it would not be thought very feasible or seasonable for 20 or 30 people to avouch such a thing there, yet at all times it is a duty never to own it. It is thought unseasonable and unfeasible to disown the tyrant's authority, but it is made necessary when urged never to own it. And for this we have the grounds of our ancestors, showing who may be disowned and must not be owned. I shall first insert here John Knox's propositions, prosecuted in his second blast, extant at the end of Anton. Gilby's admonition of England and Scotland. Number 1, quote, "It is not birth only, nor propinquity of blood, professing Christ Jesus and his eternal verity, but in his election the ordinance which God hath established in the election of inferior judges must be observed. Number 2, no manifest idolater, nor notorious transgressor of God's holy precepts ought to be promoted to any public regimen, honor, or dignity in any realm, province, or city that hath subjected themselves to Christ Jesus and his blessed angel. Third, neither can oath or promise bind any such people to obey and maintain tyrants against God and his truth unknown. Fourth, but if rashly they have promoted any manifest wicked person, or yet ignorantly have chosen such an one as, after declared himself unworthy of regimen above the people of God, and such be all idolaters and cruel persecutors, most justly may the same men depose and punish him that unadvisedly before they did nominate, appoint, and elect, unquote. Accordingly, this was done in deposing both the queens, which is fully vindicated by the Earl of Morton in his discourse to the Queen of England, as Buchanan relates it, Book 20, page 746. Quote, the deed itself, neither the custom of our ancestors of taking a course with their governors will suffer to be accounted new, nor the moderation of the punishment to be odious. For it were not needful to recount so many kings punished by death, bonds, and exile by our progenitors. For the Scottish nation, being from the beginning always free, hath created kings upon these conditions, that the government entrusted to them by the people's suffrages might be also, if the matter required, removed by the same suffrages, of which law there are many footsteps remaining even to our day. For both in the isles about and in many places of the continent in which the old language and institutions have any abode, this custom is kept in creating their governors of clans, and the ceremonies used at the entering into government do yet retain the express representation of this law. Whence it is evident that the government is nothing else but a mutual stipulation between kings and people, which further appears from the inviolated tenor of the ancient law since the beginning of the Scottish government, reserved even unto our memory, without the least essay either to abrogate it, or dismissible, or diminish it. Yea, even when our fathers have deposed, banished, and more severely punished so many kings, yet never was any mention or motion made of relaxing the rigor of that law, and not without reason, seeing it was not of that kind of constitutions that change with the times, but of those which are engraven in the minds of men from the first original, and approved by the mutual consent of all nations, and by nature's sanction continued inviolable and perpetual, which, being subject to no other laws, do command and rule all. Which in every action doth offer itself to our eyes and minds, and whether we will or not, abides in our breasts. Our predecessors followed, being always armed against violence and ready to suppress tyrants. And now, for the present, what have we done but, insisting in the footsteps of so many kingdoms and free nations, suppress tyrannical licentiousness, extolling itself above all order of laws, not indeed so severely as our predecessors in like cases. If we had imitated them, not only would we have been far from all fear of danger, but also have escaped the trouble of calumnies. What would our adversaries be at? Is it that we should arm with authority tyrants, convicted of grievous crimes, maintained by the spoils of the subjects, having hands imbrued in loyal blood, and hearts gaping for the oppression of all good men? And shall we put them upon our head, who are infamously suspected of parricide, both projected and perpetuated? Unquote. To which we may add a foreign conclusion indeed, but adduced and maintained by Mr. Craig in the Assembly in the 1564, which had been determined by learned men in Bononia, quote, all rulers, be they supreme or subordinate, may and ought to be reformed or bridled, to speak moderately, by them, by whom they are chosen, confirmed, or admitted to their office, so oft as they break that promise made by oath to their subjects, because princes are no less bound by oath to their subjects than the subjects to their princes, and therefore ought it to be kept and performed equally, according to law and condition of the oath that is made of either party. Unquote. By comparing which two testimonies together, we may see the reasons why neither of the two royal brothers that have ruled in our day could be conscientiously owned as magistrates in the case they have been in for several years past. The first testimony is for the second brother, the latter is for the first that's gone. But as for Mr. Knox's opinion, it is evident he had written a book against the government of women, which may, though he did not intend it particularly against Mary of Scotland, yet it did invalidate her authority as well as other women's. This book he owns and maintains in his first conference with her, and consequently could not own her authority as of the Lord, though he gave her common respect, as the title of majesty, etc. Yet when he was particularly urged by the Queen's question, "You think," she said, quote, "that I have no just authority," unquote, he would not answer in the affirmative, but shifted it by telling her, quote, "that learned men in all ages have had their judgment free and most commonly disagreeing from the common judgment of the world. And though," he says, "he could live under her government, so may and would the greatest disowners of tyranny, if they be not troubled with questions about owning it. Yet he affirms that with the testimony of a good conscience he had communicated his judgment to the world, and that if the realm found no inconveniences in her government, he would no further disallow that within his own breast," unquote. Certainly, then, in his conscience he did not and could not own her as the magistrate of God, and that though many things which before were holden stable had been called in doubt, yet neither Protestant nor Papist could prove that any such question was, at any time, moved in public or private. Neither could ever such a question be moved if the conscience were not posed, and then, when it must speak, it must of necessity be unpleasant to tyrants. Thus we have heard both the positions and scruples of this witness. Let us also hear his arguings that people may punish princes for their idolatry and murder, etc., and therefore much more may disown them, and therefore again much more may they forbear to own them when called. For can a dead man by law be owned to be a magistrate and keeper of the law? Quote, "Idolatry, saith he in his conference with Lethington, ought not only to be suppressed, but the idolater ought to die the death. But by whom? By the people of God. For the commandment was given to Israel, yea, a command that if it be heard that idolatry is committed in any one city, that then the whole body of the people arise and destroy that city, sparing neither man, woman, or child. But shall the king also be punished? If he be an idolater, I find no privilege granted unto kings more than unto people to offend God's majesty. But the people may not be judges to their king. God is the universal judge, so that what his word commands to be punished in the one is not to be absolved in the other, and that the people, yea, or a part of the people, may not execute God's judgments against their king, being an offender. I am sure you have no other warrant except your own imaginations, and the opinion of such as more fear to offend their princes than God," unquote. In the same conference we have the instance of Jehu adduced to prove that subjects may execute God's judgments upon their princes. It was objected Jehu was a king before he executed judgment upon Ahab's house, and the fact was extraordinary and not to be imitated. He answered he was a mere subject. Quote, "No doubt Jezebel both thought and said he was a traitor, and so did many others in Israel and Samaria. And whereas it was said that the fact was extraordinary, I say it had the ground of God's ordinary judgment, which commandeth the idolater to die the death. And therefore I yet again affirm, it is to be imitated of all those that prefer the true honor of the true worship and glory of God to the affection of flesh and wicked princes. We are not bound," said Lethington, "to follow extraordinary examples unless we have the like commandment and assurance." "I grant," said the other, "if the example repugn to the law, but where the example agrees with the law, and is, as it were, the execution of God's judgment expressed within the same, I say that the example approved of God stands to us in place of a commandment. For as God in his nature is constant and immutable, so cannot he condemn in the ages subsequent that which he hath approved in his servants before us," unquote.